Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I hope all of you are doing well, keeping yourselves safe and also sane. I apologize for bringing forward this live lecture to this hour because normally the live lecture is at 3:30. But because I have other matters to attend to this afternoon, so I had to bring forward this lecture. I hope it's not much of a problem because this lecture can also be viewed at any time according to your own convenience. So I apologize in advance if I caused any inconvenience for changing the time of this live lecture. But since there is no interaction that we are having when I'm delivering the lecture, so perhaps, inshallah, hopefully it is not a big problem for most of you. Last week, I went through some principles in dealing with the Quran, whereby we looked at various categories of verses of the Quran. So today we shall continue with certain principles in dealing with the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And these principles, again, are very basic principles, which I am pretty sure that most of you are familiar with. So basically, perhaps this is more of a recap of what you might have learned in other courses such as Ulumul Quran, such as Ulumul Hadith, for example. I'm sure that when you take certain courses related to the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, these principles might have been elaborated in much more detail, but this again serves as a recap of some of the principles that one should be familiar with when dealing with the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I don't think I need to go through the definition of the Sunnah or the definition of Hadith because this is a level 3 course. So I'm pretty sure that most of you are familiar with this term. But perhaps just simply to recap, Hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is basically that which is attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from his sayings, from his actions or deeds, from his tacit approvals, taqrir, from his physical attributes, and also his moral characteristics. So these 5 elements that constitute hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we mentioned sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is meant as something to be emulated by his followers, and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ also is the legacy by which the Prophet ﷺ leaves behind, for his followers to emulate, for his followers to extract principles from. So basically, that is the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So hadith are basically units through which the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is preserved. So we might have hadith which a hadith which does not necessarily mean or imply that it is the Sunnah. And there are various examples for that, that we can find in the books of hadith, and also explanation of scholars regarding this concept of hadith and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we have to bear this in mind, although we often use this term interchangeably, the term hadith and the term Sunnah interchangeably, there is a difference between both. So when we talk about the Sunnah, we mean the normative legacy of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When we talk about hadith, we mean each and everything which is attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that is the difference between hadith and Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So now let's look at how do we deal, or let's look at some of the principles in dealing with the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Let me share the slides. Okay, here we are. So these are some of the principles which have been outlined by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi in dealing with the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So basically there are 7. Is it 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, 8. So in trying, or in our pursuit, or in our quest to understand the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or to properly understand the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu, there are 8 things, or 8 issues that we must consider. Okay. Firstly, we should understand the Sunnah in light of the Quran. Indeed, we know that the Sunnah is the exposition of the Quran, yani it explains the Quran. And as such, hadith which are authentic, there are no hadith which are authentic which contradict the Quran or which contradicts the Quran. So Sahih established Sunnah is not found to contradict the injunctions of the Quran. So there cannot be a hadith which is authentic which contradicts the injunctions or principles in the Quran. So if people have supposed such contradiction to exist, then it must be a Sunnah that it is not authentic, or the understanding of that Sunnah is not authentic. So perhaps the hadith is authentic, but the way in which we understand the hadith or the Sunnah is not correct. And as such, one would assume there is a contradiction between the hadith and the Quran, when in fact what is wrong is our standing of that hadith. Or it may be that the contradiction is not real but merely conjecture, or it is only an assumption that the hadith contradicts the Quran when in fact it doesn't. So if there is any apparent contradiction between the Quran and the Sunnah, the Quran should be preferred over the Sunnah. Okay? So if there is an apparent contradiction and one had to choose between the Quran or the Sunnah, then the Quran prevails. So this is an important principle. Firstly, that if the hadith is authentic, it should not contradict the Sunnah. If it does, it is either the hadith is not authentic or our understanding of that hadith is not correct. Okay? Or if it seems that there is a contradiction, then the contradiction might only be a conjecture, rather than definitive contradiction. It is merely conjecture. And if there still exists that contradiction in the minds of people, or after many efforts have been done to reconcile between the Sunnah and the Quran, but that contradiction apparently still exists, then the Quran prevails. Okay, so we must understand this well, to understand the Sunnah in the light of the Quran. Secondly, when we are dealing with an issue, we should collect all relevant hadith or all relevant hadiths on that subject or on that issue. So we should gather relevant hadith on the subject together, juxtaposing the ambiguous alongside the explicit, because there are hadith which perhaps might be dhanni ad-dilala. It might be ambiguous, it might be indefinite. And there might be hadith which fall under the category of qat'i. In terms of its dilala, in terms of indication, it is definitive. So we have to put these ahadith side by side. The absolute alongside the restricted, the general alongside the particularized. The hadith which are am together with the hadith which are khas. The hadith which are muqayyad and the hadith which are mutlaq. They should be juxtaposed side by side when it comes to a particular issue and then analyzed. So what's the objective of doing so? Is to interpret one with the other, making the intended meaning plain and clear. It is by bringing all this hadith or all this sunnah together, then we can perhaps derive a correct understanding of the issue at hand. So here, bringing together the hadiths of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on a particular theme or on a particular issue, bringing them together, analyzing them together, rather than treating them as separate. Thirdly, reconciling conflicting hadith or preference between them. So if there are contradictions when it comes to hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in fact, under ulumul hadith, under the sciences of hadith, there is a branch of knowledge dealing with such contradictions, yeah, which is normally termed as mukhtalaf al-hadith, yeah, as contradictory hadith of the Prophet sallallahu. And one of the most famous scholars who dealt with such contradictions is Ibn Qutaybah, yeah. So when such occurs, yeah, or when such appears to occur, or when there is an apparent or seemingly contradiction between a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then the approach that should be taken is to reconcile, yeah, between the apparently contradictory hadith. It is feasible that two hadith that they be acted upon together. So if it is possible to act upon the hadith together, meaning one hadith, for example, hadith A says do it in a certain way, hadith B says do it in another way. But if it is possible to combine between the two, then act upon the two. And let not one of the two be suspended for the other. So if it is possible to act upon hadith A and hadith B together, then that is preferable rather than suspending one or preferring one over the other. If nothing is feasible of the two hadith except their difference, one of the two hadith is abrogating and the other is abrogated. So this issue of nas and mansukh, we have to identify. So if the contradiction still exists and we can determine chronologically which came first, which came after, then we can adopt this technique of abrogation of nas and mansukh, identifying the hadith which is abrogated, yani mansukh, and identifying the nasikh. So the nasikh prevails over the mansukh. Or if the two differ and there is no evidence as to which of the two is abrogating and which is abrogated, go for one and leave the other when that one is stronger than the other, meaning preferring the hadith which is stronger, or in terms of authenticity, it has more weight compared to the other hadith, or that one is more established than the other, or perhaps there are more hadith in support of position A rather than position B, okay? Or identify that which is closer to the Quran, or what the greater number of the companions were on. I mentioned this again. I mentioned this before, meaning that if there were more hadith on that, but on position A rather than position B, then we adopt position A. And similarly, if the companions, yeah, most of them or more of them were of the opinion A rather than B, then we adopt opinion A, yeah. But sometimes, or most of the time, it is possible to reconcile between the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in which this apparent contradiction then can be eliminated, harmonizing between the two hadith, or two or three or four hadith which seem to contradict each other, but when there are efforts to reconcile, then it will become clear to us that in fact this contradiction is merely a conjecture, or it appears to be contradicting, but in fact it is not. Fourthly, understanding causes, associations, and objectives of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we are required to know particular circumstances which the hadith text addresses. So if in relation to the Quran, we have what is known as asbabun nuzul, yeah, the reasons of revelation. So when it comes to hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have what is known as sabab wurud al-hadith, the reason for the hadith being, for example, mentioned by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or why did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam acted in a certain way, yeah. So we are required to know the particular circumstances which the hadith text addresses, yeah, because many hadith are based upon particular reasons or associated circumstances, or aimed to specific intentions. So we must not mix up between what is particular and what is general, yeah, what is temporal and what is eternal, and what is partial and what is all comprehensive, yeah. And the companions and the successors themselves they often investigated the underlying reasons and circumstances of the text and acted accordingly. So, in other words, to appreciate the maqasid underlying the hadith also is important, so that we can properly understand and then properly apply such hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam under this understanding the context or understanding the issues, yeah, in which the hadith is actually dealing with. We should also distinguish between variable means, yeah, means basically the wasila or the wasail, and fixed ends, yeah, and fixed objectives, yeah. So we also have to look at hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this sense. So perhaps there are certain actions or certain statements of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam which basically provided some examples of how to practicalize something, or how to put certain things or certain principles into practice or into action, yeah, bearing in mind certain objectives or aims which are to be achieved, yeah. So the objectives should remain, but perhaps the wasail or the wasila or the way in which to achieve that objective can change depending on the context. So as such, we have to identify, yeah, or we have to differentiate between variable means, the wasail or the different means, and also the fixed and yani the fixed objectives of the Sharia. And we have to look at hadith in such a way as well. So failing to do so is one of the primary causes for confusion and error in understanding the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the means to an end might vary due to changing circumstances. We should also, when it comes to hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, differentiate between figurative or metaphorical and also literal expressions. And this also applies to the Quran. Remember, we looked at majazi and haqiqi. Yeah. So when it comes to hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well, there are things which perhaps is meant to be taken literally, and there are also matters or issues which perhaps the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam described in a figurative or metaphorical manner. Yeah. And because in Arabic there is plenitude of figurative expressions, and being the most expressive in spoken Arabic, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam also made extensive figurative expressions. Yeah, so some of these figurative expressions convey information, while some other conveys injunctions. Yeah, it could either convey an injunction or a stipulation or just information. And a distinction is to be made, or a distinction is to be made between these two, yeah, between that which is figurative or metaphorical and literal, failing which would lead to prescribing the forbidden and vice versa, and making the supererogatory obligatory and vice versa. So we do not want then to misconstrue what is supererogatory, what is basically from the nawafil, to become something that is fard. Yeah. So that is why one needs to look at hadith or analyze hadith and identify whether it is figurative or metaphorical or literal. Yeah. So closing the door to figurative expression in understanding the hadith has led to many contemporary misunderstandings of the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we should not, yeah, close the door and say, no, we only have to understand hadith in its literal sense, but we must also provide that room or that flexibility for hadith to be understood in a figurative and metaphorical sense, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the Arabic language in particular, is what do you call it, is rich with such expressions. Also, we have to distinguish between the unseen and visible. So perhaps when the Prophet ﷺ describes matters of the unseen, one should not take it literally. Yeah. So hadith contains information regarding the visible and unseen world, And as such, the affairs of the unseen world should not be interpreted on the basis of the visible worldly affairs. Yeah? So perhaps when the Prophet ﷺ described barzakh, or described life in the hereafter, yeah, things which cannot be seen, or he describes about the angels, yeah. So this description might cause some confusion or some degree of, ta'ajjub, yani, one would think, is this real? Can such really occur? Can such really happen? So we have to differentiate. So that which is of the unseen, it is a matter of the unseen, and sometimes it is beyond human comprehension. Yeah, the Prophet ﷺ might have described it to us. Yeah, but we cannot uh, put it against a benchmark. We cannot have a benchmark in terms of, we compare between the visible worldly affairs and the invisible or unseen heavenly affairs. We cannot put them side by side and compare them, because there are basically there's that expression, comparing apple with oranges. Yeah, we should not do that. Yeah, apples must be compared with apples, and you cannot compare oranges with apples, or you cannot compare durian with rambutan, for example. Yeah, so we must bear in mind when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam describes to us certain matters of the unseen, then perhaps it might not be understood well, yeah, or it is beyond human comprehension, and it is okay in that sense, yeah, to have this or to understand such text within the limitation or of the comprehension of the human mind when it comes to unseen matters. And we should not delve into such matters too deeply, especially when it comes to things of the unseen. Adopting the lexical meanings of words, yeah, okay. The Sunnah also is to be understood in most of the cases in light of the lexical meanings of the words in which the Sunnah has come, yeah. So, for example, a certain word, it must be understood in the context in which the Prophet ﷺ lived, yeah. An example that is often given is tasawwur, taswir, yeah. This concept of taswir, in which the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that the al-musawwirun, the picture makers, will be in hell, basically, that they will be punished, yeah. So does this actually mean that photographers also will be punished? Yeah. So we have to differentiate. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the understanding of the concept of taswir is such, but in our day and age, it has evolved. So does such apply in our current context? Yeah. So that is why we have to be aware, yeah, of the lexical meanings of the words in which the Sunnah has come. Because words surely change in their connotations from one period to another, which is known to every student of the evolution of language and vocabularies, and it should not be read in current terms. So we should not read current terms into old text, yeah. So we should not read current terms into hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and impose, for example, the meaning of taswir as we understand it today onto the text, yeah, and then banning taswir altogether, yeah, banning photography altogether, when in fact that concept of taswir was non-existent in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it meant another thing. Yeah, so these are basically the approaches in dealing with the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which will assist us in properly understanding the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask in our virtual meeting, inshallah, on Thursday afternoon. Yeah, perhaps we can discuss this issue further. We can discuss more examples. Yeah, perhaps so it will become clearer to us how one should understand the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ or the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, inshallah, I think we shall stop here. Yeah, as I mentioned, this lecture was not meant to be long. I think it is less than 30 minutes. Okay. Again, I hope that you will go through the notes, and also if you have the time to watch this lecture. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم. Please stay safe, stay sane, take care of yourselves. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until we meet again, inshallah, in our virtual meeting or class on Thursday afternoon, inshallah ta'ala.